There are places on Earth where the human body is not meant to stay. In northern Greenland, winter lasts most of the year. The sun disappears. The temperature drops low enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. And yet, thousands of men were stationed there. Not explorers, not scientists, soldiers, technicians, radar operators. They lived inside a base that was never meant to be permanent, only necessary. Officially, it was just another Cold War installation. But daily life there followed rules that didn't exist anywhere else. Time stopped behaving normally. Sleep patterns collapsed. And communication with the outside world could disappear without warning. The question was never if the environment would break you, only how long it would take. And the most unsettling part, most of the men stationed there were never told how long they were expected to endure it. This is the story of the men stationed where no one was supposed to live. The base sat far above the Arctic Circle, closer to the North Pole than to any major city. On a map, it looked isolated. On the ground, it felt detached from the rest of the world entirely. The nearest major population center was thousands of kilometers away, closer to drifting ice than to civilian infrastructure, closer to silence than to help. Evacuation was not immediate. Medical emergencies were handled on site. Severe weather didn't delay support. It cancelled it. For months, the sun never rose. Then for months, it never set. The human body is not designed for either condition. Men arrived believing discipline would carry them through. They followed schedules. They trusted routines. They assumed the military had accounted for everything. It hadn't. Within weeks, many noticed the same thing. Days blended together. Night lost its meaning. Meals became the only reliable marker of time. Some slept for 14 hours and woke exhausted. Others couldn't sleep at all. There were no natural cues telling the body when to stop or start. And once that internal clock failed, everything else followed. The cold was not experienced as pain most of the time. It became a condition. Hands stiffened faster. Skin dried and cracked. Minor injuries healed slowly. The body was constantly spending energy just to remain functional. Even indoors, the environment was never forgotten. Heat was maintained, not abundant. Every system reminded you that survival was technical, not guaranteed. The environment enforced silence. Outside, wind erased sound. Inside, thick walls swallowed it. Radio contact could vanish without explanation. Weather delayed flights for weeks. Mail arrived late, or not at all. Men learned not to expect answers. If a supply plane didn't arrive, there was no explanation. If a shift ran longer than scheduled, there was no justification. If a message went unanswered, no one asked why. Questions weren't forbidden. They were pointless. What mattered was endurance. Most of the men were young. Many were on their first long posting. They were told the mission mattered. They were told it was vital. They were not told how long the assignment would last. That uncertainty did more damage than the cold. Every morning carried the same silent question. How many days are left? And every night ended without an answer. Some counted weeks. Others counted meals. A few stopped counting entirely. That was usually when the trouble began. The base was self-contained by necessity. Power, heat, food, air. Everything had to function without interruption. Failure wasn't inconvenient. It was dangerous. Men worked long shifts maintaining systems they rarely saw fail, but feared constantly. Radar consoles glowed endlessly. Alarms were tested, reset, tested again. Most days passed without incident. That didn't make them easier. In isolation, the the mind fills silence with its own noise. Small problems felt larger. Minor frustrations lingered. Arguments started over nothing and refused to end. And there was no escape. There were rules meant to protect morale. Mandatory recreation, scheduled social events, strict work rotations. They helped, until they didn't. When darkness stretched for months, the rules became symbolic. You attended events because you were required to. You exercised because it was on the schedule. None of it replaced sunlight. None of it restored a sense of normal life. Men began to withdraw. Not dramatically, quietly. They spoke less. They stayed in their quarters longer. They avoided eye contact. No one called it a problem. There wasn't a category for it. What made the situation more unsettling was the contradiction at its center. The base was critical, but the men were temporary. Systems were designed to last. Personnel were not. You were there to serve the installation, not the other way around. If the environment strained you, that was considered acceptable. If you asked to leave early, it wasn't. Replacement took time. Logistics were complex. The mission came first. Always. And so the men adapted. They learned to operate while exhausted, to function without daylight, to ignore the growing sense that the outside world was becoming distant, almost unreal. What no one warned them about was this. The environment didn't stop working on you when the assignment ended. By the time the men realized something was wrong, it was already normal. That was the danger. The base did not collapse suddenly. There were no dramatic incidents, no clear moment when someone could say, "This is where it began." What happened instead was gradual, almost polite. The mind adjusted to conditions it should never have accepted. Sleep was the first casualty. Not completely absent, just unreliable. Men learned to fall asleep under artificial light and wake up without any sense of morning. Some relied on alarms. Others waited for knocks on the door. A few stopped sleeping in long stretches altogether, taking short rests whenever exhaustion forced it. Fatigue became a background condition, not something to complain about, just something to manage. Concentration followed sleep into decline. Radar operators reported moments where screens seemed to blur. Technicians rechecked systems they had already inspected, sometimes multiple times. Simple decisions took longer. No one said why. In an environment where mistakes could carry serious consequences, admitting mental strain felt dangerous, so men stayed quiet. They learned to work through it. The base offered structure, but not meaning. Schedules told you where to be. They did not tell you why time felt distorted. Days were productive, weeks were functional. Months felt artificial. There were no seasons to mark progress. No visual changes to signal movement. Everything stayed the same. And in that sameness, the sense of purpose began to thin. Some coped by becoming rigid. They followed rules exactly. They measured meals. They exercised obsessively. Routine became a shield. Others went the opposite direction. They skipped meals. They lost track of time. They drifted between shifts and sleep without noticing transitions. Neither approach solved the problem. They only delayed it. What kept most men silent was not fear of punishment. It was hierarchy. Everyone above you had endured the same environment. If they had adapted, so should you. Reporting strain did not feel forbidden. It felt pointless. Silence wasn't enforced. It was inherited. Communication with home was limited and unreliable. Calls were short. Messages were delayed. Letters arrived weeks late, describing events that already felt distant. Families talked about seasons that didn't exist anymore. Holidays passed unnoticed. Life continued somewhere else. For many men, this created a quiet disconnect. The world beyond the base felt theoretical, like something remembered rather than experienced. Some stopped calling as often, not because they didn't care, but because explaining life there became impossible. Psychological strain was rarely labeled. There was no dramatic language for it. No one said anxiety. No one said depression. Instead, they said things like, "I'm just tired. I'm fine. It's the cold." And officially, those explanations were enough. Command structures recognized the risk, but only to a point. There were briefings about morale, instructions to watch for signs of withdrawal, guidelines for maintaining unit cohesion. But the base itself was the problem. No amount of awareness could change the darkness. No protocol could restore sunlight. You could monitor men, but you couldn't remove the environment. So the system adjusted expectations instead. Lower tolerance for error became accepted. Emotional flatness became normal. Silence became routine. Some men experienced moments that unsettled them deeply. They forgot what day it was and didn't care. They lost interest in news from home. They felt detached from their own reactions. One veteran later described it simply. It was like operating on reserve power all the time. That description appeared again and again. Reserve power. Enough to function, not enough to feel fully present. There were no official records of breakdowns, but stories circulated quietly. A man who requested reassignment without explanation. Another who began avoiding communal areas. Someone who stared at radar screens long after his shift ended. Nothing severe enough to report. Nothing minor enough to ignore. What made the situation particularly difficult was the lack of an end date. Some deployments were extended without warning. Weather delayed rotations. Logistics shifted priorities. Men prepared to leave, then stayed. That uncertainty eroded motivation faster than cold ever could. When you know how long something will last, endurance is possible. When you don't, the mind begins to search for shortcuts. Disengagement became one of them. The base demanded constant readiness. Systems could not fail. Alertness could not lapse. And yet, the environment worked continuously against both. This contradiction sat at the center of daily life. You were expected to perform perfectly in conditions that degraded performance by design. No one said it out loud. Everyone felt it. Some men counted down days again, not because they knew how many remained, but because counting gave structure. Others stopped marking time entirely. That was often mistaken for resilience. It wasn't. It was adaptation. And adaptation, in this place, came with a cost. By the time men began preparing to leave, many believed everything would return to normal once they were gone. They were wrong. Leaving the base did not feel like an ending. There was no clear moment of release. No sudden return to normal life. Departure was procedural. Orders were signed. Flights were scheduled, weather permitting. Bags were packed the same way they had been unpacked. Quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. For many men, the expectation was simple. Once they left the Arctic, everything would reset. It didn't. The first shock came with light. Natural daylight felt overwhelming. Some men squinted instinctively, even under overcast skies. Others reported headaches that lasted for days. Sleep did not normalize immediately. The body, trained to function without natural cues, struggled to accept them again. Night felt unfamiliar. Morning arrived too fast. A few men woke suddenly, disoriented, unsure where they were. That confusion usually passed. Other effects stayed longer. Conversation became difficult. Friends asked what it had been like. Families expected stories. Most men didn't know how to answer. The experience resisted explanation. There was no single event to describe, no dramatic episode to summarize. It had been pressure without a peak, strain without a moment of collapse. So many said nothing. They spoke about the cold, they joked about the darkness, they avoided the rest. Some noticed changes in themselves only after returning. Patience shortened. Silence became uncomfortable or necessary. Crowded rooms felt overwhelming. Others struggled with routine. Work felt slow. Noise felt excessive. Time felt oddly structured, too rigid or too loose. They had spent months adapting to an environment where normal rules did not apply. Returning meant relearning how to live under them. What unsettled many veterans was how little acknowledgement followed. There were no formal debriefs about psychological strain, no long-term monitoring, no vocabulary for what they had experienced. The assumption was simple. If you completed the assignment, you were fine. And if you weren't, adjustment was your responsibility. Most did, quietly. Years later, some began to speak. Not publicly, not officially. In small conversations. In interviews conducted long after service. In private reflections. What emerged was consistent. The base had not been traumatic in the traditional sense. There were no explosions, no combat. But it had been corrosive. It wore away at the edges of perception. It altered how time felt. It changed how silence was experienced. Those changes did not disappear just because the assignment ended. What this reveals is not a failure of discipline. It reveals a system built around equipment, not people. The base functioned as intended. Radar systems remained operational. Infrastructure endured. Human endurance was assumed, not measured. The environment was treated as a technical problem. Psychological strain was treated as background noise. Manageable, acceptable, secondary. This logic was not accidental. Cold War installations like this were designed for continuity, not comfort. They were meant to operate through worst-case scenarios. If conditions were unbearable, that was not considered a flaw. It was considered proof of necessity. Human cost was not ignored. It was absorbed, distributed across rotations, hidden in personnel turnover, lost in silence. The men stationed there understood this instinctively. They did not expect gratitude. They did not expect recognition. What many expected, but never received, was clarity. How long would this last? What were the limits? What happened if adaptation failed? Those questions were never answered, because the system did not need them to be. Today, the base still exists. Technology has improved. Conditions are marginally better. But the fundamental reality remains unchanged. It is still a place where humans are required to live beyond normal limits. Still an environment that demands adaptation rather than offering support. The mission continues. The cost is still paid quietly. The story of these men is not about heroism in the traditional sense. It is about compliance, endurance, silence. They were stationed where no one was supposed to live, not because it was humane, but because it was strategically necessary. And when they left, the system moved on without pause. The base did not remember them, but many of them remembered the base, in disrupted sleep, in altered perception of time, in the lingering sense that normal life sometimes feels unreal. This is what long-term isolation does, not in theory, but in practice, not dramatically, not immediately, gradually. And once it takes hold, it does not simply reverse. It fades, it settles, it becomes part of how you see the world. That is the part rarely included in official histories. The systems are documented, the missions are archived, the infrastructure is measured. But the human experience remains largely unrecorded, not because it was insignificant, but because it was inconvenient. These men were never meant to stay. They were meant to endure. And for the system, that was enough.